He was 99 and had been in hospice 9 months, and he came anyway, wheeled into an Atlanta church to sit beneath his wife's casket. 77 years married, America decided that was the whole story. It wasn't. In the summer of 1953, Rosalynn Carter stopped speaking to her husband. He had resigned his Navy commission and moved her back to Plains, Georgia, without asking. She called it the worst argument of their marriage, in print, 30 years later. 24 years after that, she was taking notes in cabinet meetings. It began with one movie date in July 1945, in Plains. Hold on to that 1953 argument, because everything the country later believed about this woman depends on you not knowing about it. The image we inherited is the hand-holding. Two people in their 90s on a porch in a town of 600, still together, still building houses for strangers, the last unembarrassing marriage in American public life. And the version of Rosalynn inside that image is the quiet one, the wife who followed. Southern, soft-voiced, deferential, the woman standing a half step behind the man at the microphone. Here's what that image leaves out. She sat in on cabinet meetings and took notes. She had a working office in the East Wing with a staff and a standing weekly lunch with the president where she brought an agenda. In 1977, she was sent to 7 Latin American countries as his envoy and briefed by the State Department beforehand, and she talked policy with heads of government who had not been informed that she would. In February 1979, she testified before a Senate subcommittee, the First Lady to do that since Eleanor Roosevelt. She told her husband he was wrong on a regular basis, in private, at volume, for decades. None of that made it into the myth. Some of that is sexism, and some of it is the 70s, but a lot of it is her. She was raised in a house where you did not make a scene, and she got very good at making her opposition invisible. That skill is the whole story. It is also, eventually, the weapon. She was born Eleanor Rosalynn Smith in August 1927, 3 miles of red dirt from where she would die. Her father, Edgar Smith, drove the school bus and ran a garage and farmed a little on the side, which in Plains during the Depression was 3 jobs adding up to almost nothing. Her mother, Allie, sewed for other people. In 1940, Edgar Smith was diagnosed with leukemia. He was 39. Rosalynn was 13 and the oldest of 4. She wrote about what happened next in her memoir, and it's the most important thing she ever put on paper. He called the children into his room and told them he was dying. He also told them he wanted them to go to college. Then he was gone, and her mother took in more sewing and eventually took a job at the post office. And Rosalynn became the one who ran the younger children, the cooking, the watching, the keeping of a house where grief was not discussed, because discussing it did not accomplish anything. Look at what that produces in a person. Not fragility, competence. She learned that if she was useful enough, nobody would look too closely at what she was feeling, and that being useful was the only currency a girl in Plains actually had. She learned to manage. She learned to keep her mouth shut and get the thing done anyway. And she learned to want out. Plains was not a place she loved. It was a place she was stuck in, taking care of everyone, with a dead father's instruction about college sitting on her chest. Her best friend was Ruth Carter, whose family farmed at archery a few miles out, and whose older brother was away at the Naval Academy. There was a photograph of him in Ruth's room. Rosalynn saw it and, by her own later telling, thought about it more than she should have. That's her account, given long after she'd become famous, so weigh it accordingly. The woman was capable of a good line. But there's no reason to doubt the basic fact. She knew who he was before she met him. They went out in July 1945, home on leave, to a movie. She was 17. He was 20, in the summer between his last 2 years at Annapolis, and he went home that night and told his mother he'd met the girl he was going to marry. That anecdote comes from the Carters themselves and has been polished by 50 years of retelling. What isn't polished is the timeline, and the timeline is aggressive. That was July. At Christmas, he proposed. She said no. That refusal is the single most underreported fact in this marriage. She was 18, she was being asked by a Naval Academy midshipman to leave a town that was suffocating her, and she turned him down because she had promised her dying father she would finish college, and she was in the middle of doing it at the junior college in Americus. She had, in other words, a competing obligation, and she chose it over him. In February 1946, she went to Annapolis to visit, and he asked again, and she said yes. Whatever she extracted in that 6-week interval is not in the record. What is in the record is that from the first negotiation of their lives, she made him ask twice. They married on the 7th of July, 1946, at the Plains Methodist Church, a month after his graduation. He was 21, she was 18. Now, a wedding is normally where a story like this shows you the machinery, the guest list, the money, the family setting terms. This one shows you the machinery by having none. It was small. It was fast. There was no society page, no press, no political guests, because there was no politics yet, and no money at all. The honeymoon, by the usual accounts, was a week at Chimney Rock in North Carolina. And then they drove to Norfolk, Virginia, where a naval officer's pay was going to have to cover both of them. Family recollections, most of them recorded decades later, suggest Jimmy's mother Lillian was not especially warm about the match. That's a soft source, and I'll treat it as one. But it points at something real. Rosalynn was marrying into a family with a hard, dominating father in Earl Carter, and she was leaving before she ever had to live under him. The escape and the marriage were the same act. That matters enormously in about 7 years. What followed were, by her own repeated account, the happiest years of her life. Norfolk first, on battleships. Then he volunteered for submarines, and they went to Honolulu, then New London, Connecticut, then Schenectady, New York, when Hyman Rickover pulled him into the nuclear program. 4 postings, 3 sons, Jack in 1947, Chip in 1950, Jeff in 1952, each one born in a different place, none of them born in Georgia. He was at sea constantly, and this is where the standard reading gets it exactly backward. The absence wasn't the injury. The absence was the freedom. She had her own household in cities where nobody knew her father had died broke, where no mother-in-law lived down the road, where she made every decision about money, children, housing, and doctors alone because there was no one else to make them. She handled the finances. She moved the family. She raised 3 boys on a junior officer's salary in 4 states in 6 years, and she was very, very good at it. She had built exactly the life the 13-year-old had been promised she'd never get. In the spring of 1953, Earl Carter was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Jimmy went home to Plains that summer to see him and stayed a while, and while he was there, he watched something he hadn't expected. Half the county came through that house. His father had been quietly carrying people, paying for medicine, covering debts, funding kids through school, and none of the family had known the scale of it. Earl Carter died in July. Jimmy came back to Schenectady and told his wife he was resigning his commission and taking them back to Plains to run the peanut farm. He did not ask her. She has said, in print and on the record, that she argued with him the whole way, and that it was the angriest she had been at him in their marriage, the first genuine rupture, in her telling, in 7 years. She did not want to go. She had nothing waiting for her in Plains except the version of herself she had spent her entire adult life escaping. The girl who takes care of everybody, in a town that already knew everything about her. She argued. She lost. In the fall of 1953, they moved back to a place where they qualified for public housing, and moved into apartment 9A, which is how the future President of the United States became the only one who had ever lived in government-subsidized housing. And then she did something nobody in either family expected. She went to the warehouse and took the books. The first crop year, 1954, was a drought year, and the Carter peanut business cleared somewhere around $200 for 12 months of work. They were, functionally, broke. So Rosalynn started keeping the accounts, and when she found she didn't know enough, she signed up for a correspondence course in accounting and taught herself the rest. Within a few years, she was running the books, the payroll, the ordering, and the scales. Farmers coming in to sell their crop dealt with her. Her husband said later that she knew as much about the business as he did. In some tellings, he went further and said she knew more. Whether he actually believed that or was being gallant is unknowable, but the practical record is not ambiguous. When he started running for office and disappeared for months at a time, the company kept operating, because she was the one operating it. That's the trade she made in Plains. She lost the argument about where to live and immediately went and acquired the one thing the argument had cost her: control. Not over him. Over the money. Keep that in mind, because for the next 20 years, almost every fight in this marriage runs on the same mechanism. He decides. She objects. He wins. She then takes possession of some piece of the resulting situation and runs it better than he could have. In 1962, he ran for the Georgia State Senate, and the race produced one of the last genuinely unembarrassed election thefts in the American South. In Quitman County, a local boss named Joe Hurst ran the machine, and on Election Day in the town of Georgetown, the ballot box was stuffed in front of witnesses. People voting in alphabetical order, dead men voting, the box itself standing on a table where anyone could reach into it. Carter lost the county by a wide margin and lost the nomination. He fought it. He got a lawyer, got the press interested, got the ballots examined, and had the result overturned in time to be seated. He wrote a whole book about it 30 years later, in 1992, which tells you something about how much the episode mattered to him, and also means the most detailed account we have of it is his own, published from a considerable distance. For Rosalynn, the lesson was structural. Politics was not a hobby he was going to get out of his system. It was the thing that was going to determine where she lived, what she did, and how much of her husband existed at any given moment. She began campaigning. She was terrified of public speaking, genuinely, physically, and her solution was not to conquer the fear, but to rout around it. She went door to door. She worked county to county, alone in a car, shaking hands one at a time, which suited a woman who had spent her adolescence being competent quietly. In 1966, he ran for governor and lost, and the man who won was Lester Maddox, a segregationist who had made his name refusing to serve black customers at his restaurant. Carter came out of that race in debt, and by every account, including his own, in a depression that lasted months. What happened next is the part of the marriage that most people get wrong. In 1967, he had a religious experience, a conversation with his sister Ruth in the woods, a rededication, the language of being born again. He talked about it publicly for the rest of his life. It became central to his identity and eventually to his national brand. She did not follow him into it. Rosalynn Carter was a lifelong practicing Methodist who taught Sunday school and prayed daily, and she was not remotely the same kind of believer he was. She never described a moment of conversion. She never spoke the language of surrender. When he came back from the woods transformed, she stayed where she was, a woman with a private, practical, unglamorous faith who did not experience her husband's certainty and, over the years, developed a fairly visible impatience with the parts of it that got in the way of winning. That gap explains something that otherwise looks strange. This is a marriage constantly described as a spiritual partnership, and it was not. It was a working partnership between a mystic and a manager. Their fourth child, Amy, was born in October 1967, 15 years after their third. Rosalynn was 40. The three boys were nearly grown. Amy would be the child of the governor's mansion, and then the White House, photographed constantly, and the only one of the four whose entire childhood was public property. In 1970, he ran for governor again, and he ran ugly. This is the part the later mythology sanded off. To beat Carl Sanders, a moderate former governor, Carter went hunting for the voters who had elected Lester Maddox. He called Sanders Cufflinks Carl. He declined to condemn segregationists, praised Maddox's work, courted George Wallace's people in South Georgia, and let his campaign put out material that white voters in rural counties read exactly as intended. He never made an explicit segregationist pledge. He didn't have to. He won. And in January 1971, standing on the Capitol steps at his inauguration, he announced that the time for racial discrimination in Georgia was over. It made the cover of Time. It made him, nationally, a new kind of Southerner. Both things are true, and they happened 4 months apart. He ran as one man and governed as another, and the second one was the real one. And the first one was the price. Rosalynn campaigned inside that strategy. She was in those counties, shaking those hands, working those crowds. She was not a naive bystander to how her husband got elected, and this is where you have to stop thinking of her as the passive one. She knew what the campaign was doing. She kept doing it. The woman who had learned at 13 that grief is handled silently had grown into a woman who could hold a great deal of knowledge without visible discomfort. And it was during that same 1970 campaign, by her account, that she found her subject. She was working a shift change at a cotton mill. That's where you go if you want to shake 400 hands in 20 minutes. And a woman told her she worked nights so that she could be home during the day with a daughter who was mentally ill. Rosalynn started asking about it everywhere she went, and kept hearing the same thing. Families were doing this alone. There was nothing. At an event afterward, she got in a receiving line to ask her own husband what he intended to do about mental health in Georgia. He told her they'd have the best program in the country, and he'd put her in charge of it. That story comes from her, retold many times, and it has the shine of an anecdote that's been handled a lot. But the follow-through is documented. He created a commission on services to the mentally and emotionally handicapped, and she served on it. And Georgia went from 16 community mental health centers to well over 100 during his single term. She had found the thing that was hers. Not his. Hers. By 1976, they had built a two-headed campaign. She traveled separately, on her own schedule with her own staff, running her own map, which meant that on any given day, the Carter operation was covering twice the ground. Reporters started calling her the Steel Magnolia, which was meant as a compliment about a soft exterior, and which she never bothered to correct, because a reputation for softness is extremely useful when you are the one deciding which states get worked. Then, in September, the campaign nearly detonated over an interview her husband gave to Playboy, in which he said he had looked on a lot of women with lust and committed adultery in his heart many times. It was a sincere theological statement about the impossibility of judging others, delivered in the least sincere magazine in America, and it cost him something like 15 points of a lead. Various accounts have Rosalynn unamused. What she actually said in private isn't reliably preserved, and I'm not going to pretend it is. What's certain is that the man who nearly lost a presidency by talking too openly about his own conscience was married to a woman who had never once been accused of that. They won in November, and this is the false peace, the moment where the story looks like it resolves into partnership and reward. What actually happened in the White House was stranger and much less comfortable for everyone watching. She took an office in the East Wing and ran it like an office, staff, memos, portfolio. She started attending cabinet meetings, sitting off to the side, taking notes, saying nothing in the room, and a great deal afterward. They instituted a working lunch, and she came with items. She could not chair the President's Commission on Mental Health because a federal anti-nepotism statute from 1967 prevented it. So she was made honorary chair and simply did the work anyway. Then in June 1977, he sent her to Latin America. 7 countries in 13 days: Jamaica, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela. She took Spanish lessons. She was briefed by the State Department. She went in with positions on arms sales, human rights, and nuclear proliferation, and she carried substantive discussions with heads of state who had assumed they were receiving a courtesy visit from a president's wife. The reaction at home was brutal, and the objection was always the same sentence in different mouths. Nobody elected her. She kept going anyway. And on the 7th of February, 1979, she walked into a Senate hearing room to testify under her own name, the First Lady to do it since Eleanor Roosevelt. She was there to get a bill. She got it. It survived 10 months. The Mental Health Systems Act was signed in October 1980, 3 weeks before the election. It was the first serious federal rewrite of mental health policy since 1963. Money for community centers, for the chronically ill, for children, for the people she'd been hearing about since that cotton mill shift change 10 years earlier. In August 1981, Ronald Reagan's budget reconciliation bill converted almost all of it into block grants and cut the funding, and the act was effectively dead before a single dollar reached most of the programs it authorized. She had spent a decade on it. It lasted less than a year. That is the actual injury of the Carter presidency for her, and it is not the one anyone talks about. The one everyone talks about is Iran. From November 1979, when the embassy in Tehran was seized, the administration had 52 hostages and no leverage, and the president made a decision that he never really reversed. He would not campaign. He stayed at the White House. He treated the crisis as a thing to be solved rather than a thing to be survived politically. She thought that was wrong, and she said so, repeatedly. Her position, which she has stated publicly since, was that the presidency required him to be out in the country making the case, and that refusing to do so was not nobility, it was surrender. She was overruled. She went out and campaigned in his place, in a season where every stop meant answering for a rescue attempt that had failed in the desert and a hostage count that never moved. He lost 44 states. There's a documented asymmetry in how the two of them handled that. He came to terms with it fairly quickly. The theology helped. The temperament helped. She did not. She has said, without much decoration, that she was bitter, and that it took her a long time to stop being bitter, and that she was angry at the country in a way he never allowed himself to be. She was 53 years old. She had lost the office, the program, and the argument, all inside 12 months. Then they came home to Plains and found out they were about $1 million in debt. The peanut business had been in a blind trust for 4 years and had been badly managed while they were gone. They had no income and a warehouse they couldn't service the debt on. They sold it. The thing she had taken over in 1954, taught herself accounting to run, and kept alive through 4 campaigns, gone to Archer Daniels Midland to pay off what the trust had lost. She was back where she started, in the same small town, with less than when she'd left. And this time, nobody was going to hand her an institution to run. So she built one. The Carter Center opened in 1982. His idea, initially, as a place to mediate conflicts, and then increasingly a joint enterprise, where she took mental health as her portfolio, and simply kept working, running annual symposiums, pushing on stigma and parity and caregiving for the next 40 years. In 1984, they went to New York on a bus with a church group to work on a building for Habitat for Humanity, and the image of 2 former occupants of the White House swinging hammers became one of the most durable pieces of political iconography in modern America. And in 1987, they nearly ended the marriage over a book. They had agreed to co-write something about the years after leaving Washington. It was published as Everything to Gain, Making the Most of the Rest of Your Life, which is a genial, forgettable title attached to the single, most revealing episode in 77 years. He wrote fast, in bursts, and considered a draft finished. She wrote slowly, revised endlessly, and considered nothing finished. They were working from the same computer files, which meant each could rewrite the other. He would change her paragraphs. She would change them back. They stopped speaking about it and started leaving each other notes on the machine. Both of them described this afterward as the worst period of the marriage, and by both accounts it got bad enough that the editor at Doubleday had to intervene, and the resolution was to identify the disputed passages by author, so that certain paragraphs in the finished book carry initials indicating which Carter wrote them. That is a peace treaty. 2 people who could not agree on a shared account of their own life resolved it by publishing separate versions side by side and marking whose was whose. Nothing else in the record tells you as much about what this marriage actually was. Not a merger of 2 people into one voice. A negotiation between 2 people who each intended to keep their own. And here is where the whole thing turns, because look at what she does for the next 35 years. She writes 4 books under her own name. First Lady from Plains in 1984 while the wounds were fresh, which is where the 1953 argument comes from, where the anger about Iran comes from, where the detail about running the warehouse comes from. Then a book on caregiving in 1994, then helping someone with mental illness, then Within Our Reach in 2010, still arguing at 83. She founded the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregiving in 1987. At Georgia Southwestern, the same junior college in Americus she had promised her dying father she would finish. She built fellowships for journalists covering mental health, which is to say she spent decades quietly funding and training the people who would write the coverage. The woman who could not stand to give a speech ended up shaping how an entire subject got reported. Understand what that adds up to. In a family whose public record was going to be controlled by a presidential library, an authorized shelf of his memoirs, a Nobel Prize, and the extraordinary gravitational pull of a man who wrote 30-odd books, she wrote her own version and put her name on it first. First Lady from Plains came out in 1984, 3 years before he ever published his own account of the White House years. She spoke first. That's the reversal. Not that she was secretly miserable, she wasn't. And any script telling you she endured 77 years of hell is selling you something the evidence won't cover. She loved him. The affection is documented from every direction and across every decade, including from people with no reason to flatter either of them. What she was overruled. On leaving the Navy in 1953, on the timing and the terms of his political life, over and over, on Iran, when it mattered most. 3 times the direction of her entire existence was set by a decision she argued against and lost. And each time, instead of leaving or sulking or accepting the role she'd been assigned, she went and took possession of whatever the loss had put within reach. The books at the warehouse, the mental health commission, the campaign map, the Senate hearing room, the archive of her own story. In May 2023, the family announced she had been diagnosed with dementia. She had spent her adult life defining herself as the person who takes care of everyone, starting at 13 with 3 younger siblings and a dead father. And she ended as the one being cared for, in the house in Plains, by a husband in hospice who had outlived every prediction. She died on the 19th of November 2023 at 96. Now go back to the photograph. The old man in the wheelchair under the casket, and the 77 years, and the hand-holding on the porch. It's not a picture of a woman who followed a man. It's a picture of the end of a 77-year argument that she conducted almost entirely out of public hearing. Because she was raised in a house where you did not make a scene, and because she figured out very young that a woman who appears to be agreeing is a woman nobody thinks to stop. The country called her the Steel Magnolia and thought the magnolia was the point. She let them.